How to align with the universe and know you're on the right path. Yes, aligning with the universe is less about chasing signs and more about becoming so clear, calm, and honest that the right path stops feeling like a mystery and starts feeling like recognition. Research on mindfulness shows that present moment awareness is linked with greater purpose, more happiness, and lower anxiety and depression, which is why real alignment often feels grounded before it feels mystical. Most people think alignment with the universe arrives like fireworks, a spiritual portal, or some dramatic awakening that shakes reality in a single afternoon. But the wiser path usually begins much quieter than that. A person often suffers not because the universe is silent, but because noise, rush, and borrowed expectations drown out the voice of the soul. Mindfulness research supports this by defining presence as awareness without judgment and linking it to better well-being. So the counterintuitive truth is this: the right path rarely starts with doing more, and often starts with stopping long enough to hear the higher self again. That shift is where spirituality, self-knowledge, healing, and personal development stop sounding poetic and start becoming practical. And once a seeker sees that, the first crack in the old reality opens, hinting that alignment has rules most people never notice. Topic 1. Stop romanticizing alignment. A person who is beginning a spiritual awakening often expects the universe to send perfect certainty, non-stop energy, and instant inner peace. Yet presence-based practices are described as simple awareness of what is happening now, not a permanent emotional high, and that matters because alignment is steadier than hype. In real life, spiritual growth looks more like honesty than drama, more like consciousness than performance, and more like returning to the true self than impressing anyone online. The soul usually whispers while the ego arrives with a megaphone and excellent branding. That is why the first lesson in spiritual development is to stop chasing a mood and start noticing what actually creates peace. When someone is out of alignment, life can feel strangely crowded even in silence, as if too many people, opinions, and obligations are renting rooms inside the mind without paying. Mayo Clinic's guidance notes that overthinking, planning, random negative thoughts, and constant mental noise can be draining and can increase stress, anxiety, and depressive symptoms. So the person who wants healing must first recognize that confusion is not always a lack of answers. Sometimes it is simply a surplus of static. This is where self-knowledge begins to cut through the fog. And once the static is named, the seeker is ready to learn how quiet becomes a tool instead of an absence. Silence scares the unprepared mind because it removes distraction, and distraction has a funny way of dressing up like destiny. A wise seeker learns that spirituality is not escape from reality, but a cleaner relationship with reality, where the soul no longer has to shout over chaos. That change starts to awaken spiritual vision because the person begins seeing what drains energy, what restores it, and what no longer fits the calling. Suddenly, the path looks less like a cosmic lottery and more like a pattern. And that pattern opens the door to the next practice, learning to become still on purpose. Topic 2. Build a relationship with stillness. Mindfulness is commonly defined as being fully present with what one is sensing and feeling without judgment, and simple exercises like focused breathing or paying close attention to ordinary objects are recommended ways to practice it. In plain terms, a person does not align with the universe by forcing revelation. That person aligns by becoming available to it. 5 quiet minutes in the morning can do more for consciousness than an entire week of frantic spiritual content. It is not flashy, but neither is sunrise, and sunrise still gets the job done. Once stillness becomes familiar, intuition stops sounding like random noise. A practical example helps here. The seeker can sit with a notebook, place both feet on the floor, inhale for 4 counts, exhale for 6, and write one sentence that begins with, "Today the soul wants." Then the person can meditate for 7 minutes, not to levitate into mysticism, but to notice breath, body, and emotion without arguing with them. Regular mindfulness practice is associated with reduced stress, less negative thinking, and improved mood, which makes discernment easier when life decisions appear. This is how awakening becomes embodied rather than decorative. And once the body becomes part of the conversation, its signals become impossible to ignore. Many people miss alignment because they only trust thoughts, while the body has been filing spiritual reports for months. A person may notice tightness before the wrong decision, spaciousness before the right one, or sudden fatigue around people who disturb inner peace. That does not make every sensation a prophecy, of course. Sometimes the universe is speaking, and sometimes lunch was just too heavy. But over time, stillness teaches the difference between fear, intuition, and plain old indigestion, and that discernment leads naturally into the next stage, clearing what keeps personal energy scattered. Topic 3. Close the leaks. A seeker cannot elevate your soul while leaking energy into every argument, every fake obligation, and every role that no longer matches the true self. Research on mindfulness and purpose suggests that clearer awareness supports value clarification and engagement with what actually matters, which is one reason alignment often requires subtraction before addition. So the person who wants transformation begins asking sharper questions. What creates life? What creates heaviness? What feels like soul nourishment and what feels like self-abandonment? These questions don't just sound wise. They reorganize reality from the inside out. This stage often feels like spiritual isolation, and that can be unsettling because the old crowd may no longer understand the new consciousness. A person in awakening may speak less, cancel more, protect sleep, avoid gossip, and feel less interested in proving anything. That is not always loneliness. Sometimes it is healing, sometimes it is recalibration, and sometimes the universe is simply closing noisy tabs in the browser of the soul. The seeker starts noticing energetic hypersensitivity too, where certain rooms, conversations, and digital habits hit like emotional caffeine after midnight. And that sharpened sensitivity prepares the person to identify what alignment actually feels like. One useful exercise is to do an energy audit at the end of each day with 3 columns: gave energy, drained energy, taught energy. The person may discover that 10 minutes of prayer, sunlight, walking, or sincere conversation restores more than 2 hours of scrolling through other people's carefully edited enlightenment. That discovery brings healing because the seeker stops treating exhaustion like a personality trait. Bit by bit, spirituality becomes measurable in ordinary life, and once the leaks are visible, values can finally take the wheel. Topic 4. Follow values, not vanity. Purpose in life has been described as a sense of direction organized around meaningful aims, and research links it with greater happiness and lower anxiety and depression symptoms. That matters because alignment with the universe is not just a feeling in the chest. It is a life built around what the soul actually respects. A person who values honesty but lives to please everyone will feel split, even while repeating beautiful affirmations. No crystal can out-negotiate chronic self-betrayal. So the wiser question is not, what looks impressive, but, what is worthy of the soul's devotion? The seeker may feel called toward service, art, teaching, caregiving, leadership, craftsmanship, or deep personal growth, and the right path usually carries both peace and responsibility. This is where calling becomes less theatrical and more exact. A person may not have the full map, but that person can usually name one value that must not be abandoned again. And that single value becomes a compass when signs still seem unclear. A practical example makes this real. If the true self values truth, the person stops saying yes when the whole body means no. If the soul values healing, the seeker books therapy, starts journaling, joins a support circle, or reads one solid book on personal development instead of collecting 20 unopened tabs like spiritual trophies. If the higher self values creation, the person writes one page, records one video, or launches one humble project. That is how the universe tends to meet people, mid-step, not mid-fantasy. And from there, the signs of being on the right path begin to reveal themselves more clearly. Topic 5. Notice the signs. The right path often comes with paradox. More peace, but also more responsibility. More clarity, but also more pruning. More inner peace, but not necessarily more comfort. Research suggests that mindfulness connects with purpose and behavioral activation, meaning that as people gain clarity, they also tend to engage more with meaningful action. So alignment is not numbness or passivity. it often produces cleaner movement. The soul becomes quieter inside and braver outside. A seeker can watch for 7 symptoms that often suggest real alignment is taking root. Less need to force outcomes, deeper trust in timing, cleaner boundaries, increased self-knowledge, more compassion, a stronger pull toward healing, and a subtle but steady sense of rightness. These signs do not mean the path is easy. They mean the person is no longer fighting the truth every step of the way. There may also be tears for no obvious reason, because transformation sometimes washes the heart before it rebuilds the life. Spirituality can be tender like that. And when these symptoms appear, action becomes the next sacred test. Another sign is that the seeker starts respecting small instructions. The universe may not say, "Quit everything and move to a mountain," but it may whisper, "Sleep earlier, call that person, finish the application, leave the draining circle, meditate before touching the phone." The person who follows these smaller nudges usually receives clearer ones later. After all, why would the soul send advanced coordinates to someone ignoring the first turn? And that is where alignment stops being interpretation and becomes obedience. Topic 6. Move with the message. Research in the mindfulness purpose literature ties purpose to behavioral activation, or the willingness to do difficult but meaningful actions that fit long-term goals. In ordinary language, a person knows the path more clearly after walking on it. Waiting for complete certainty can become a polished form of fear, and fear loves to wear spiritual clothing when it wants to stay employed. The universe often responds to movement, not to endless rehearsal, so personal growth requires action that matches the inner message. This is where the seeker learns a simple rhythm. Listen, choose, move, reflect, repeat. One person may feel called to improve health and begin with 20-minute walks and less sugar. Another may sense a creative awakening and commit to writing every morning before the world barges in with its opinions. These are not small acts to the soul, because repeated action teaches consciousness that the person is finally trustworthy. And trust, once rebuilt inside, changes the quality of external signs. The path starts to answer because the walker has started to cooperate. There is usually a funny moment here when the mind says, "But what if this isn't divine guidance?" And the wiser self replies, "Then at least the house got cleaned, the body got rested, and the proposal got sent." That kind of grounded humor protects a seeker from spiritual vanity. It keeps mysticism practical, and practical mysticism is often where the deepest transformation hides. Once action is flowing, relationships begin revealing who can walk beside the new version of the soul, and that can be both liberating and awkward. Topic 7. Let relationships reveal the path. Alignment changes relationships because a person with clearer energy, stronger boundaries, and deeper spirituality becomes harder to manipulate. The seeker may outgrow dynamics built on guilt, performance, rescuing, or emotional confusion. That can trigger more spiritual isolation for a season, but it also creates room for healthier resonance. The universe often clears company before it expands calling. And yes, sometimes the soul's glow-up makes the wrong room very uncomfortable. A person on the right path usually feels less fascinated by being chosen and more committed to being truthful. That shift brings inner peace because approval is no longer the main currency of the heart. The seeker starts asking whether a connection supports healing, spiritual growth, and personal development, or whether it keeps the true self in survival mode. This is not coldness, it is maturity with a pulse. And that maturity opens a deeper trust in timing. A practical test helps here. After meeting someone, the person can ask, "Did this connection leave the soul clearer or cloudier?" If the body feels contracted, confused, and emotionally noisy every single time, that pattern deserves attention. If the heart feels grounded, honest, and more connected to the higher self, that matters too. Relationships become mirrors, not masters, and when the seeker learns from those mirrors, timing starts looking less random and more intelligent. Topic 8. Trust timing without going passive. Mindfulness guidance encourages daily practice over time until it becomes second nature, which is a useful reminder that alignment is usually cultivated rather than instantly downloaded. A person may be on the right path and still experience delays, doubt, or temporary detours. That does not mean the universe has closed the energetic portal. It may simply mean the soul is being strengthened to carry what it asked for. Spiritual growth is often slower than ego prefers and wiser than ego understands. Trusting timing does not mean doing nothing. It means doing today's work without demanding tomorrow's guarantee, which is a far more mature form of faith than dramatic waiting. A seeker in real awakening keeps showing up, keeps listening, keeps refining habits, keeps choosing what protects inner peace, and keeps making room for enlightenment to become embodied. The path reveals itself in layers because the person is changing in layers, and each layer makes reality look different. Eventually, something beautiful happens. The seeker stops asking, "Am I on the right path?" every 5 minutes. The soul begins to recognize the frequency of alignment through calm, coherence, energy, and a quiet increase in courage. Spirituality becomes less about chasing the next sign and more about living in a way that keeps the heart, body, and consciousness available to truth. That is when the universe no longer feels far away. It feels woven into ordinary life, like breath, timing, and the next faithful step. So the person who wants to align with the universe must become honest enough to hear, still enough to feel, brave enough to act, and wise enough to release what no longer matches the soul. That is the road of spirituality, healing, self-knowledge, awakening, transformation, and real personal growth. The kind that does not just inspire a moment, but rewrites a life. Now the question is uncomfortable on purpose. How much longer will that seeker call it waiting for a sign, when deep down the sign has already been given? What would change this week if that person finally trusted the calling, protected inner peace, chose the true self, and decided to elevate your soul without apology? Subscribe to the channel, enable notifications, and keep walking this path of spiritual development, consciousness, mysticism, and living partnership with the universe.